It is my pleasure to introduce our closing keynote speaker, Dr. Carmen Lawrence. I'll give you a brief bio of Dr. Carmen Lawrence. After training as a research psychologist at the University of Western Australia and lecturing in a number of Australian universities, Dr. Lawrence entered politics in 1986, serving at both the state and federal levels for 21 years. She was at various times W.A Minister for Education and Aboriginal Affairs and was the first woman Premier and Treasurer of a state government. She shifted to federal politics in 1994 when she was elected as the member for Fremantle and was appointed Minister for Health and Human Services and Minister assisting the Prime Minister on the status of women. She held various portfolios in opposition, including Indigenous Affairs, Environment, Industry and Innovation, and was elected National President of the Labour Party in 2004. She retired from politics in 2007. She is now Director of the Centre for the Study of Social Change in the School of Psychological Science at the University of Western Australia and was until recently Chair of the Australian Heritage Council. Delegates, please welcome Dr. Carmen Lawrence.
Thank you, and this is going to be something of a cook's tour, I think. You may find bits of it that interest you and bits of it that send you to sleep. So I hope the balance is well struck. I first want to pay my respects to the traditional owners, the Noongar people on whose land we're meeting today, and to acknowledge the traditional owners past, present and to come, and to say something that Mark McKenna suggested that we always include in these acknowledgements, and that is that the land has never been ceded. The land was taken from Indigenous Australians. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today about my views on the importance of archives in any age, Blade Runner or not, and of the value of diligent and accurate record keeping at a time when it seems under threat from alternative facts and massive technological change. As you might expect, my views are informed by my study of psychology and by my period as a Member of Parliament and Minister in both state and federal politics. You've heard about that in my CV. These experiences, and many others as a private citizen, have also alerted me to some of the risks inherent in the construction and use of archives in various forms. Most people would agree, as I do, that high quality, easily accessible archives are fundamental to a healthy society, contributing to transparency in our governments, corporations and institutions. Indeed, it may be said to be a truism that a fully functioning democracy is only possible if the public is well informed. Conversely, if people are systematically misinformed, indeed even misled, it's likely that societal decisions will be less than optimal. Archives allow us, as you know, to reconstruct past events and trace their consequences, enabling us to tell our stories with some accuracy. When accessed, they also provide the data that assist us in designing current policies, allowing us to avoid past mistakes. I was on the Gonski panel, for example, and the archives in state governments in particular, while hard to access, were very important. I don't need to tell this audience, but it's worth reminding the rest of us that archives are important because they provide evidence of past activities and help us understand the social structures and institutions we've inherited, how they got to be the way they are. They allow us too to tell our stories. They can also increase our sense of identity and better our understanding of the many cultures. They can even ensure justice. Sometimes they tell us unpleasant stories we'd rather forget, that we'd rather airbrush from our history. We should also remind ourselves, and I've often had cause to do this, that some records are specifically and deliberately created for official purposes. Some, however, are not. And it's these unexpected sources which may sometimes provide a less biased account of events than official archives and sources, carefully curated to provide protection for the powerful. This is where your decisions as archivists about what to retain and what to let disappear are formative. However, for governments, historians, political scientists, as well as sociologists, geologists, agricultural and medical researchers, the list goes on, and countless other fields of study, it's hard to imagine life without the storehouse of material contained in archival records. Although some of us may tend to take this material for granted, I think we should actually celebrate the fact that many official records are available to the public, because it hasn't always been so. And we should object too when public access is unreasonably restricted, because however incomplete, such records are the raw stuff of history, the very historical framework of our country, and a vital and necessary ingredient of any society which aims to govern itself responsibly. Public records are needed in a democracy for people to understand the methods and indeed the motivations of their elected leaders. Transparency, as you know, is essential to keep citizens informed, even in those instances where the information may not cast a positive light on our leaders or our institutions. This tension between a government wishing to protect its most cherished and sometimes embarrassing secrets and the public's right to know how their government functions is a constant thread throughout our history, indeed most nations' histories. One indeed that's central to any democracy. That tension is important. Those of you who watched the recent Four Corners programs on the treatment of the frail elderly in Australia's nursing homes, for example, will no doubt have been struck by the contradiction between the official records on quality standards and the brutal reality uncovered by the hidden cameras placed in residents' rooms. Without the alternative, unofficial view of the circumstances in these facilities, future generations might have viewed these institutions as peerless. After all, many of them performed at 100% of the standards. Obviously, both sets of records should now form part of any archive on the subject of aged care in the 21st century. In order for us to understand why such records are important, we need to remind ourselves too why history is important. Too often, when some people say that they value history, they mean that they like the sanitised version that makes them feel good, the things that we boast about. And there's plenty in our past that can inspire us and about which we can feel proud, but there's also much to regret. History is not necessarily about making us feel comfortable. We shouldn't just use history, as Robert Penn Warren put it, to serve as our private alibi factory, as some politicians certainly do. Something that's become all too common too in the so-called culture wars. We know too that governments don't often investigate themselves and broadcast it to the world, especially when the news is bad. Although this is precisely what the government I led here in Western Australia did in the early 90s, when we instituted a Royal Commission into WA Inc., the relationship between business and the commercial activities of government. It was politicians and their business partners who were in the firing line. Its findings, while scarifying, led to very strong recommendations for improving transparency and accountability and a subsequent further inquiry. Among those recommendations was one to establish a truly independent government records office. Subsequently, this was implemented, but now, some decades later, it's under threat from administrative changes made without apparent regard for the earlier lessons. They seem to have been forgotten, and they're certainly being overlooked. As in this case, the Royal Commission, our history should sometimes make us feel very uncomfortable, and ideally cause us to act in ways that prevent the recurrence of whatever is contained in the archives. If the evidence is there, archival history has the power to redefine or even destroy cherished assumptions and blind prejudices, and cause us to rethink some of the origins of our institutions and our common culture. keep in mind that the crucial part of that sentence is, if the evidence is there. In the end, our history can be no more complete than our sources allow. And obviously that's where you come in. The bare essentials of uncovering our past involve scouring the official records, newspapers, and now the digital records. Good luck with that. The memoirs and diaries, few are now in hard copy, many ephemeral, and the documents from private institutions and businesses. You as creators and users of archives understand their limitations and the fact that they can be sanitised. If I can be excused a personal reference which illustrates the point, and this really struck me at the time I discovered it. One of the sources that's used here in exploring West Australian history is the so-called Cyclopedia of Western Australia, edited by J.S. Batty and published in 1912. Some of you may be familiar with it. It was promoted at the time as providing a historical and commercial review, including, it says, descriptive and biographical facts about Western Australia. There's an entry which refers to my great-great-grandfather, Henry Lawrence, described as a solid pioneer and good citizen, said to have arrived in Western Australia on the Wild Wave in 1853, taking up a position in charge of the convicts on Rottnest, and later as warden of Fremantle Asylum. Apart from the fact that he arrived in Western Australia, none of the rest of this story is true. Like the account of his funeral in the local paper after he died, and the engraving on his tombstone, there's no mention at all in the account of the fact that he was a convict transported for 15 years for sheep stealing from Berkshire, arriving on the Adelaide in 1855. He was later granted a ticket of leave and issued a land grant near Northam, where he farmed until his death. And I'm sure he was a solid, upright citizen by then. It was not until the convict records, another archive, were released that the family were able to see the airbrushing and the active insertion of an alternative reality. It took some work to create that story that had taken place. My grandmother, his daughter-in-law, insisted vehemently that there were no convicts in the family, although there were some on her side as well. This reminds us that every record-keeping act occurs in context and is undertaken for a reason. It's seen as useful and appropriate to the time and may, through the eyes of later observers, seem incomplete or inappropriate or simply wrong. And the records themselves may be limited by the fallibility of the original observers, their motivations and their values. And we certainly must be aware of that in this age of so-called alternative facts, when truth is not truth. And as a psychologist, I'm particularly interested in those failures of perception and memory. Observation, first-hand accounts, and memory, as we know, are notoriously fallible. They're not mechanical processes free of bias and inaccuracy. As one psychologist, Kilstrom, wrote in 1994, memory isn't like reading a book, it's more like writing a book from fragmentary notes. Or Thelin says memory, private and individual as much as collective and cultural, is constructed and reproduced. This construction is not made in isolation, but in conversations with others that occur in the context of community, broader politics and social dynamics. These are processes. My students of advanced psychology are required to understand the limitations of human perception and memory, and the consequences for public policy, particularly, of failing to take these limitations into account. We learn that we cannot always trust people's recollections and recording of their experiences, even when they're trying very hard. And despite a massive research in psychology, it's fair to say that most people still assume that people's observations and their memory for events, if they're well motivated, are generally accurate. Certainly the legal system is based on that presumption. And we continue to believe, by and large, that we can safely reconstruct official events from the past from the recollections of witnesses to or participants in such events. However, there's now a mountain of research on eyewitness testimony that shows that many of the assumptions about perception and memory are either incomplete or erroneous. For example, a person's expectations and needs influence what information he or she acquires in each new experience. It's fair to say that we tend to see and hear what we expect to see and hear, sometimes called confirmation bias. You may be familiar with it. It's trotted out all the time now to explain people only hearing what they want to hear. In one investigation of this effect, students were shown a videotape of a disturbance which resulted in a scuffle. The tape showed events that purportedly took place in a public forum. And before viewing the tape, the students were offered one of two explanations of the motives for those involved in the incident. One group were told that the participants were angry radicals who intended to prevent the speaker completing a controversial address. The other group were told that it was a matter of protecting free speech and that the people wanted to ensure that both sides of the argument would be heard. They both saw the same images. After viewing the tape, witnesses were asked to recall what had actually happened. Those who were led to believe the angry radical motivation remembered more details that were consistent with that story and were less likely to recall facts that showed the participants in a better light, and vice versa. When it comes to what we remember, there's a disturbingly high error rate, revealed in both naturalistic and laboratory settings. And a lot of research has catalogued the many ways in which such recollections may be modified and supplanted. In some cases, entirely false memories can be created. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of this work. It's been popularised to some extent. Elizabeth Loftus is one of the best-known researchers in this field, and I notice she's been quoted in the Keynote events in the US at the moment on the different recollections that people have of those times. But she's one of the best-known researchers and says, given the findings from her very many studies over many years, she tries to promote what she calls a healthy scepticism about holding up any memory, even a piece of memory, as literally true. Her studies, along with a substantial corpus of what is now quite sophisticated research, show that memory is malleable, better understood using an active reconstructionist model, as those quotes earlier showed, as a creative blending of fact and fiction. An eminent researcher in the field, Ulrich Neisser, observes, neither perception nor memory, bluntly, is a copying process. Now, we all know that we forget, but the passage of time alone doesn't account for all the slippages of memory. What occurs during that time also has a major effect and explains some of the memory loss and the errors that we can observe. For instance, after witnessing an event, people are frequently exposed to new information, which can dramatically affect our memory for the original event. It happens very quickly now with 24/7 events. New information can not only supplement, but also transform memory. And some of you may be aware of the classic studies that Loftus undertook. She shows subjects a series in those days of slides, but now videos showing an accident involving a car and pedestrians. She has been particularly interested in the legal application of these questions. And for one group, they see the car going through a stop sign and the other a give way sign. And then people are asked a series of questions a little later about what they saw. But in those questions, they're either invited to believe that it was a stop sign or a give way sign. And sometimes the information they're given is consistent with what they actually saw, and sometimes it's not. And very interestingly, in those cases, when they're led to believe that something is inconsistent with what they saw, they're inclined to move in the direction of the inconsistent image. So even though it was a stop sign, it's suggested in the question it was a yield sign, and very many of them forget what they've originally seen and move in the direction that the questioner has suggested. So Loftus and her colleagues alone have conducted more than 200 experiments involving some 20,000 subjects that document how exposure to misinformation of this kind induces memory distortion. Fairly unimportant, you might think, but if it can happen in those circumstances, imagine when that message is repeated over and over again. And their investigations have demonstrated that real witnesses to live events can have their memories distorted as well. So it's not just in the laboratory that these things have occurred. Subjects in these misinformation paradigms, as she calls them, have been shown in a variety of settings to incorporate into their memories details whose source was not their own personal experience, but rather information provided by other people or another person. To the extent that the conditions favour the misinformation over the original, the person can be left with a memory that is largely a social construction, rather than a representation of a real experience. And of course, one possible source of misinformation in everyday life is the media, so much more potent in the age of social media and vehicles like Twitter. Even more powerful, and I'll just briefly mention this, is the demonstration that it's possible to go beyond simply modifying, if you like, stretching people's memories, to actually planting entirely false memories. In a series of experiments, Loftus and associates used the plausible childhood memory of being lost in a shopping mall, something that we might all be able to imagine. And they asked their adult subjects to try to remember childhood events that they had actually occurred to them. And then they got the family to put together a little book on the various memories that these people had, experiences these people had really had. And Loftus and her colleagues inserted a couple of things that clearly had not happened to these people. And then they were asked, seeing this list of events, to say whether or not they'd occurred. Tick the ones that had actually occurred, but many of them ticked the ones that had not occurred. And interestingly, subsequently, when they were asked what it was that had happened during their childhood, they remembered the things that had never happened to them, as well as the ones that had. And there have been very many studies of this kind. These false autobiographical memories can also be created by suggestion and imagination, just getting people to imagine the circumstances that are included in the experiments. As Loftus concludes from all of this research, in her review of the malleability of eyewitness accounts, the most important lesson is to remain sceptical about the precision of that vital but frequently unreliable resource, the human memory, which is not to put you off collecting such information, but to make you very well aware that there are pitfalls. Of course, more malign forces than memory fallibility may be at work in what many now call the post-truth age. Making up facts and repeating them over and over again starts to produce an alternate reality, one to which its adherents typically cling with pretty fierce determination, often resisting data which challenge their position. That's a whole other set of questions which I think deserve examination. Why do people stick with those things that are not true? This body of research has converged on the conclusion that corrections are rarely fully effective. Some of my own colleagues have done this work. That is, despite misinformation being corrected and despite acknowledging the correction, and sometimes despite being warned ahead of time that they're being given misinformation, people generally continue to rely on the information that they may know to be false, but at some level deny it being false. This phenomenon, known as the continued influence effect, has been observed across a broad range of materials and modes of testing, persisting even when participants are warned at the outset that they may be misinformed. Some have suggested that the framing of the current post-truth malaise as misinformation that can be corrected actually fails to capture the full scope of the problem, since this label tacitly implies that misinformation is really not much more than a bit of a blemish on the information landscape which can readily be corrected. It fails to capture the reality, as some people have observed, that it's not just a flaw in the mirror, but it's the creation of a whole alternate reality. And for those who understand the power of propaganda, it was ever thus. A lot of these phenomena are not new. Certainly totalitarian regimes spend considerable resources fostering such alternative realities. Just think about the Russian versions of the Novichok poisoning in the UK. And they use vast data repositories to track and manage their citizens, seeking to manipulate history and recreate the world to conform to the government-sanctioned view. And again, you can look around the world and see many instances of that today. In the course I teach at the University of WA about the relevance of psychology to understanding contemporary social problems and policy solutions, I stress to students that in order to judge what people are likely to do in the future, we need to know about where they've been, what forces are acting on them, and how they see the world. That's cultural, it's historical. We need to know people's history as much as we do the contemporary influences on them and their institutions. And we need to know the local circumstances of their lives, the places and the people. For this, of course, archives are critical. We also study how people can distort reality and retreat into denial, including of the bleeding obvious at times, a disease which seems to be spreading at lightning speed thanks to a certain US president, who I'm pleased to say actually caused the UN assembled today to laugh when he claimed to be the best at everything. His boasting finally got the appropriate response. In teaching this program, I've tried to lift my gaze and that of my students beyond our borders and our times, and to live with doubt in attempting to understand the sources of extremism, social conflict, and state-sanctioned murder. For example, the route we take necessarily traverses the globe, from our own turf to Germany, Rwanda, Argentina, China, Syria, you can make the list. I ask them in particular to examine the legacies of the Holocaust, which, while deeply troubling, are knowable, although still denied, of course, by some. But it's been traced in many ways, in literature, film, poetry, biography, in political and historical analysis, in psychology and sociology. Probing questions have been asked about how normal processes of human thought and emotion could be so manipulated and deformed that ordinary people became Hitler's willing executioners. We ask how so many ordinary Germans could stand by as their Jewish neighbours were first branded and excluded from normal life, then herded into ghettos and cattle trucks, and then say that they didn't know what was happening. And about the enduring effects on the Jewish people and on German society of the murderous project that was the Holocaust. And while satisfactory answers to these questions may be elusive, despite all that inquiry, they are at least asked, and they continue to influence public discourse and policy in Germany, although the anti-Semitic forces on the far right are again on the move, as we know. But however insistent, those who would deny or minimise the Holocaust are thwarted time and again by the archives. Ironically, often by the obsessive record-keeping of the Nazi bureaucrats. For example, the ITS Bad Orelsen Holocaust Archive, now open to both researchers and the general public, having been closed for many years, contains Nazi records of about 17.5 million people, Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, mental patients, people with various disabilities, political prisoners, and other undesirables who were persecuted during the regime's 12 years in power. Originally, these archives were used to trace the victims and survivors of the Holocaust, and it's reckoned to contain the fullest records of Nazi persecutions in existence. There are over 50 million pages housed in thousands of filing cabinets in 6 buildings. There are 16 miles of shelves holding information about the victims of the Nazis. The documents, scraps of paper, transport lists, registration books, labour documents, medical records, and finally death registers record the arrest, transportation and extermination of the victims, in some cases even the amount and size of the head lice. The archive contains the famous Schindler's List, with the names of the 1,000 prisoners saved by the factory owner Oskar Schindler, who told the Nazis he needed the prisoners to work in his factory. Records of Anne Frank's journey from Amsterdam to Bergen-Belsen, where she died at the age of 15, can also be found among the millions of documents in this archive. The Mauthausen concentration camp's death book records, apparently meticulously handwritten, show how on April the 20th, 1942, one prisoner after another was shot in the back of the head every 2 minutes for 90 hours. The camp commandant had ordered these executions, it is recorded, as a birthday present for Hitler. It's often the case that evidence of such brutal crimes and their ultimate reckoning is the result of careful record keeping by the perpetrators and their allies. Contrast, as I've done in another essay in the Griffith Review, the availability and exploration of this and other archives to that of post-war communist Chinese government atrocities. Contemporary Chinese accounts of the miracle of Chinese industrialisation appear to treat the Chinese government and its people as having sprung into being just yesterday, with nothing relevant in their past to provide an understanding or insight about their current politics. It surely can't be that the profoundly disturbing experiences, for instance, of the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward having produced mass starvation and resulted in the death of an estimated 36 million people between the late 1950s and early 60s, when I was at university, we can't believe that that's not still shaping Chinese society. Many of the protagonists are still alive, and their children are in positions of power, and many of the victims and their children still live with the consequences of malnutrition and of the collective madness they were forced to endure. But there has been no acknowledgement, no official acknowledgement, and no reckoning. Successive Chinese governments continue to ascribe the deaths to natural causes. However, the country was laid so low that the engineered famine's effects are still being felt half a century later for those who look. As Zhu Jun, a young woman who interviewed the rural people who bore the brunt of this monstrous experiment, reports, unlike the history of the Holocaust in Europe, in China there is no collective memory, no public monument, no museum, no remembrance day, and no mention of the Great Leap Forward under Mao in any school or history textbook. And it's why Yang Zhisheng's explicit goal in writing an account of these times, Tombstone, published in Hong Kong but banned in mainland China, was to erect a memorial, a tombstone to his father and to the many who died victims of the state's economic policies. In the preface he writes, and I think this is a very important quote, "A tombstone is memory made concrete. Human memory is the ladder on which a country and a people advance. It's the road sign on mankind's journey. We must remember not only the good things, but also the bad, not only the bright spots, but also the darkness. The authorities in a totalitarian system strive to conceal their faults and extol their merits, gloss over their errors, and forcibly eradicate all memory of man-made calamity, darkness, and evil. For that reason, the Chinese are prone to historical amnesia," he says, "an amnesia imposed by those in power. I erect this tombstone so that people will remember and henceforth renounce man-made calamity, darkness, and evil." That airbrushing the past that he's referring to often serves very overt political purposes, as it has done there, as we've also seen recently in Russia. But I think the important thing here is for us to examine how it might refer to our own experiences. Concealing the bleak side of our history and seeking to wipe it from memory is, as the German philosopher Theodor Adorno observes, the antithesis of what is needed in a truly civilised country. A serious working through of the past via an act of clear consciousness that enables us to see how we are shaped by our history. And even when we look at the grossness of the Holocaust and those experiences in China, it shouldn't blind us to our own experiences here, particularly in the treatment of Indigenous people in this country. My own experience is instructive, I think. I grew up in a wheat belt town near Murrawar, here in Western Australia, on land that was first taken for farming in the 1900s, and like most of the kids in the post-war years, I knew nothing at all about the local Aboriginal people or their culture. Indeed, it looked like it was some kind of conspiracy to deny their very existence. There were a few Aboriginal families living and working in the district on farms and for the railways, but they did remain for most of us near invisible, except on the football field when we like to celebrate their achievements. They were clearly not encouraged to parade their Aboriginality, and we were not encouraged to explore it. It appeared to me as a child that being an Aboriginal Australian was a handicap that had to be overcome if these families wanted to be part of the wider white Australian society. And what else, we imagined, could they want? We were told that our Aboriginal families were a bit different, almost like us, not like the ones who lived in grinding poverty on the fringes of neighbouring towns in corrugated iron humpies, huddled together on government reserves. No one apparently thought to ask why the Aboriginal people were living as they did, or how they had lived before farmers arrived and took their land. Indeed, no one thought to even cast it in those terms. Took their land? We were taught nothing of their history or their culture or the effects on them of our arrival. We were urged to pray for them, as well as giving money, so that they would hear the word of God, I was at a Catholic school, and become good Catholics worthy of entering the kingdom of heaven. But as objects of such charity, they appeared no different from the kids in other missions in India or Africa, who were also on our prayer list. I cannot remember ever being told that the Aboriginal people had any special claim on us because of the appropriation of their land and what had been done to them by the invading Europeans. Indeed, these events were never admitted, never cast in those terms. Only later did I become aware that many of these children had been removed from their families for their own good and were part of the stolen generation. It was only much later that I began to think about and to understand the monumental wrong that had been done to our Indigenous peoples, to appreciate the seismic shift in their lives wrought by the colonial invasion of their lands. Why had we failed to see what was staring us in the face? Why had we failed to ask the obvious questions? There were records and there were witnesses, but the nation had its face to the wall. And now this stance is mercifully harder to sustain, as Indigenous witnesses and academic research has shown us so much when stories long ignored are finally being told. I'm sure many of you are now familiar with the gradual, reluctant exposure of the many murders of Aboriginal people as Europeans appropriated their land and of their resistance in the so-called frontier wars. Sometimes called by previous politicians a black armband view of history, but in reality, history. You may also be familiar with some of the local records collected by A.O. Neville, the chief protector of Aborigines from 15 to 36 last century, records which enabled Neville to enforce the 1905 Aboriginal Act with ferocity, as it's been described, exercising control over the lives of so many Aboriginal people. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Anna Haybeck, Darryl Kickett and Margaret Colbung, who are undertaking research into those archives now. And I'll just quote from their description of their work, because I think it's a very important part of especially West Australian inquiry. Families, they say, were a major focus of Neville's duties and of his record system. As Mick Dodson wrote in 1994, Aboriginal kinship and family structures, the fulcrum and map of Indigenous law and power, were primary targets of state intervention, breaking them up, pulling them apart. Knowledge is power, and the records were complicit, they say, in the systematic violation of families' rights to remain together and to pass on Aboriginal knowledge and culture down the generations. Capturing this knowledge shifted authority on family matters from ancient Aboriginal lineages to government offices. The expanding family genealogies that calculated fractional degrees of Aboriginal descent constituted a racial archive as detailed as any of the Francis Galton eugenic charts. From the 1980s, writers negotiating between the archive and family stories produced major works combining both, and they continue to do this work. Some people have wondered just how useful these records are. The bureaucratic language, the cruelty of them make us want to step back. But fortunately for us, the archive also contained Noongar voices, treasures of ancestors, as Haybeck and her colleagues put it, words that are unmediated by colonial values and bureaucratic rules, interviews and testimonies and letters, which Haybeck and her colleagues are now digging out. And significantly, they're returning these stories to their communities as part of the project. They locate, copy, return the material to writers' families and hold yarning sessions with the elders, families and community gatherings to share the stories and the memories. They've identified over 100 letters and say there are more to be found on a broad range of topics: Aboriginal rights, complaints of mistreatment, surviving poverty and family life. As they've written, it was also clear that the archive was a ticking time bomb. The dutifully documented words in its files exposed for the first time the extent of the despotic powers wielded by the state government over Aboriginal people during the 20th century. These are records that we cannot turn our backs on. I'm conscious now of the time, and I just want to make one final point, and that is that in these circumstances, where for the most part Indigenous disadvantage has not been read through the prism of history, through the accurate recording of Indigenous stories and Indigenous experiences, public policy has rested on a very perverted and peculiar idea about why and how it is that Aboriginal people often find themselves in difficult circumstances. I think it's extraordinary that when we talk about the intervention and cashless welfare cards, we locate the disability and the disadvantage in the individual Aboriginal person and not in the circumstances of their lives. The material that we have before us all over Australia now, which I'm pleased to say is now being reread in many cases, reinterpreted from those early colonial interpretations, will allow us to embrace the Uluru State from the heart, which generously offers us, the non-Aboriginal people of this country, to incorporate Indigenous culture into our lives. The task is now to throw a light on institutionalised racism and discrimination in the Australian state, to fully engage Indigenous people and to build respect for Indigenous peoples, recognising their honoured place as the first peoples of this land. And just in conclusion, I sympathise with you as I looked around at the task that you've set yourselves of navigating your way through what James Bridle calls the new dark age, one in which the equation of knowledge and power maybe has collapsed under the sheer tonnage of information, data, news, opinion, political spectacle, fact, falsehood, all mobilised by contemporary technology. Maybe he's right in asserting that not only is knowledge no longer power, it isn't even really knowledge anymore. As he puts it, we find ourselves today connected to vast repositories of knowledge, and yet we've not learned to think. The abundance of information and the plurality of worldviews now accessible to us through the internet are not producing a coherent consensus reality, but one riven by fundamentalist insistence on simplistic narratives, conspiracy theories, and post-factual politics. The value we've placed upon knowledge is destroyed by the abundance of that profitable commodity. Maybe the remedy lies in learning to think. Thank you.